Case 1. Tamilore Odunsi was 23 years old and close to finishing nursing school when her life was taken on April 26, 2025. Friends called her Tammy. She was described as focused, kind, and excited about becoming a nurse. In just a few days, she was expected to graduate. Instead, her name became linked to a case that exposed how ordinary roommate tension can turn into deadly violence. Tamilore lived in a Houston apartment with a roommate she had known for only a short time. Reports later showed they had been sharing the space for roughly 2 months. Like many shared homes, the apartment came with rules, routines, and shared responsibilities. Police and court records say disagreements had been happening, including arguments tied to their cats. These were not public confrontations. They happened behind a closed door in a place meant to feel safe. Over time, frustration grew, and the conflict remained unresolved. On April 26, 2025, that tension reached a breaking point. According to investigators, a dispute inside the apartment turned violent. Tamilore was stabbed multiple times. When officers arrived, they found her critically injured. Emergency responders tried to help, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. The man accused of killing her was identified as her 40-year-old roommate, Chester Lamar Grant. Police said he was still inside the apartment when they entered and had injuries of his own. He was taken into custody and later charged with murder. Investigators stated that the argument involving their cats was part of a wider pattern of conflict, not a single moment that came out of nowhere. Court filings and media reports emphasized that the issue was an ongoing tension between two people sharing a small space, rather than a random act. Tamilore's death sent shockwaves through her family, her school, and the nursing community. She was a student at Texas Woman's University, where classmates described her as dedicated and compassionate. Many said she talked often about helping patients and making her family proud. Vigils were held in her memory, and messages poured in from people who never met her but felt the weight of her story. The timing made the loss even heavier. She was days away from earning the degree she had worked toward for years. As the investigation moved forward, more details came to light. Police confirmed there was no sign of forced entry, reinforcing that this was not a random break-in. The violence happened between people who shared keys, space, and daily routines. Prosecutors later laid out evidence showing the argument escalated inside the apartment. The suspect was formally charged, and the case entered the court system, where it remains subject to legal proceedings. Beyond the courtroom, the case sparked wider discussion about safety and shared housing. Roommate arrangements are common, especially for students and young workers. They lower costs, but increase daily contact. Experts say warning signs should never be ignored. Repeated arguments, fear in the home, threats, or tension that does not ease. Friends and family later said they wished more had been done to step in early. Police and counselors often stress that asking for help or changing living arrangements can prevent tragedy. Tamilore's family also took legal action after her death. They filed a lawsuit connected to the apartment complex, claiming failures related to safety and tenant screening. While that case follows a separate path from the criminal charges, it shows how families seek accountability when a life is lost under preventable circumstances. For them, justice is not only about punishment, it is about change and awareness. If you'd love to see more murder documentaries, please support my channel by liking this video and subscribing. Thank you very much. Case 2. Edwin Echevarria was 65 years old when he was killed inside a Manhattan apartment in early February 2025 by someone he had taken into his home and treated like family. He was not simply living with a random roommate. According to prosecutors, Echevarria had a long-standing personal connection to Christian Millet, the 23-year-old man later charged with his murder. Millet was the grandson of Echevarria's former girlfriend, and authorities said Echevarria acted as a grandfather figure, offering him a place to stay while he tried to get back on his feet. What was meant to be an act of support inside a shared home became the setting for a violent crime that stunned investigators and the public. The case first came to light on February 5, 2025, when a ferry captain spotted a suitcase floating in the East River near Governor's Island. The sighting prompted an immediate response from authorities, who recovered the suitcase and transported it to Pier 16 in Manhattan for further examination. Inside were human remains, later identified as belonging to Edwin Echevarria. That discovery transformed what had been a missing person concern into a homicide investigation and set detectives on a fast-moving search for answers. Investigators quickly focused on Echevarria's Lower East Side apartment, where he had been living with Millet. There were no signs of forced entry and no evidence pointing to an outside attacker. Detectives instead looked inward, examining the relationships inside the home. Prosecutors later explained that the two men shared daily life and routines, and that Echevarria had taken on a stabilizing role in Millet's life. That closeness, however, also meant that conflict had no buffer. When disagreements arose, they played out in private, away from neighbors and without intervention. Law enforcement later identified a specific trigger for the fatal encounter: an argument over food. While many shared housing disputes revolve around everyday issues, authorities said this disagreement escalated rapidly. According to prosecutors, Echevarria was on a phone call when the confrontation turned violent, leaving him vulnerable in the moment the attack began. The incident did not spill into public view or draw immediate attention. It ended inside the apartment, unseen, until investigators pieced together what had happened. In court, prosecutors laid out allegations that underscored the severity of the attack. They stated that Millet assaulted Echevarria with repeated force and used a homemade weapon. While early media reports commonly referred to the weapon as an ice pick, court documents clarified that investigators identified it as a screwdriver with a sharpened head. Prosecutors alleged that Echevarria was stabbed approximately 13 to 14 times, an allegation used to argue intent and sustained violence rather than a brief struggle. These details became central to the murder charge filed against Millet. After the killing, authorities said Millet attempted to conceal the crime. According to investigators, Echevarria's body was dismembered and placed into a suitcase, which was later dumped into the East River. The recovery of that suitcase near Governor's Island and its transfer to Pier 16 for investigation became the crucial break in the case. It allowed police to identify the victim and trace the crime back to the apartment the two men shared. Without that discovery, detectives said, the disappearance might have remained unresolved for far longer. Christian Millet was arrested on February 12, 2025, roughly 1 week after the remains were recovered. He was charged with second-degree murder, along with additional charges related to the handling of the remains. During court proceedings, prosecutors highlighted statements Millet allegedly made following his arrest. According to the prosecution, Millet admitted that during the attack, he felt what he described as an insane urge to kill. That statement was emphasized to support claims about his state of mind and intent at the time of the killing. A judge ordered Millet held without bail as the case moved through the court system. Case 3. Trang Phuong Ho's life ended inside a shared student suite at Harvard University. She lived in Dunster House, a residence meant to provide stability and safety during the demanding years of college life. Instead, that space became the scene of one of the most disturbing roommate-related tragedies in campus history, a case that would later raise lasting questions about warning signs, planning, and institutional responsibility. Trang shared her suite with Sinedu Tadesse, a 20-year-old Harvard junior. Another student, Thao Nguyen, was also present as a guest. When the attack began, Thao tried to protect Trang and was seriously injured in the process. Her survival is a critical part of the story, showing that the violence did not stop with one victim and that others in the room were placed in immediate danger. Investigators later made clear that what happened on May 28 was not a sudden outburst. Evidence pointed to planning in the days before the attack. Tadesse purchased a hunting knife in advance. She also mailed a photograph of herself along with a note to the Harvard Crimson, the university's student newspaper, promising what she called a very juicy story. While the note itself did not explain what was coming, the inclusion of her photograph meant that editors were able to identify her immediately after the incident. This detail later became one of the most troubling warning signs cited in discussions about missed opportunities to intervene. Another key development emerged from accounts of the roommates' relationship shortly before the killings. Some sources reported that Trang had decided to live with someone else for the following academic year and had communicated this decision to Tadesse not long before the incident. Investigators noted that this news may have acted as a spark, intensifying already existing tension between the two roommates. While it was not presented as a sole cause, it was described as a recent change that added emotional strain to an already fragile situation. On the morning of May 28, 1995, Trang Phuong Ho was attacked while she was asleep in the shared suite. Official autopsy and police records later confirmed that she sustained 45 stab wounds. Thao Nguyen attempted to intervene and was badly hurt but survived. After the attack, Sinedu Tadesse took her own life. Police found no evidence of forced entry and no indication that anyone else was involved. The official ruling was a homicide followed by suicide, all contained within the shared living space at Dunster House. The discovery of the incident sent shockwaves across Harvard's campus. Emergency vehicles surrounded the residence, and parts of Dunster House were closed as police conducted their investigation. Students were told there was no ongoing threat, but the emotional impact was immediate. Many struggled to reconcile the violence with the image of safety and order often associated with elite university housing. Vigils and memorial gatherings were organized, and counseling services were promoted campus-wide as students tried to process what had happened. As investigators reviewed the case, attention turned to mental health warning signs. Authorities noted that Sinedu Tadesse had missed several scheduled clinical appointments at university health services in the period leading up to the attack. While specific medical details were not publicly released, investigators highlighted the missed appointments as significant. They suggested that formal systems were already aware of concerns, but that engagement had broken down. Combined with the note sent to the student newspaper and the purchase of the knife, these details formed a picture of warning signs that only became fully clear after the tragedy. In the years that followed, Trang's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Harvard University. The lawsuit alleged institutional failure, arguing that the university ignored clear indicators of Tadesse's deteriorating mental health and failed to act decisively despite warning signs. The family claimed that stronger intervention and oversight could have prevented the deaths. Harvard disputed these allegations, but the lawsuit shifted the public conversation toward accountability and how universities respond when students show signs of serious distress. The case gained renewed national attention with the publication of Halfway Heaven by Melanie Thernstrom. The book examined the Dunster House tragedy in depth, arguing that warning signs were present and that institutional culture at elite universities could discourage strong intervention. Halfway Heaven became controversial. Harvard administrators publicly challenged aspects of its conclusions and disputed some of its interpretations. Despite the debate, the book ensured the case remained part of long-term discussions about mental health, responsibility, and student safety. Trang Phuong Ho was remembered as intelligent, focused, and deeply committed to her studies. Friends described her as thoughtful and serious about her future. Thao Nguyen's survival added another layer of pain to the story. She carried physical injuries and lasting emotional trauma from trying to stop the attack. The death of Sinedu Tadesse raised difficult questions about how much distress can exist unnoticed in high-pressure environments and how systems can fail to respond in time. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. Case 4. Alexa Cannon was just 20 years old when her life ended inside an off-campus apartment in Radford, Virginia, a home she shared with someone she trusted as both a roommate and a close friend. The killing did not happen recently. It occurred on January 24, 2019, a date that permanently marked the Radford community. Cannon was living near campus with Luisa Inez Tudela Harris Cutting, a woman friends consistently described as extremely close to her. From the outside, the apartment looked like countless others occupied by young adults starting independent lives. Inside, however, events unfolded that would end one life and reshape many others. On January 24, 2019, emergency responders were called to the apartment after reports of a violent incident. When police arrived, they found Alexa Cannon dead inside the residence. Investigators later confirmed that Cannon had been stabbed more than 30 times, a level of violence that immediately ruled out an accident or brief altercation. There was no forced entry and no evidence of an outside attacker. From the earliest moments, detectives determined the violence happened entirely inside the shared apartment, between the two women who lived there. The relationship between Cannon and Cutting quickly became central to the investigation. They were not strangers paired by convenience. Friends and acquaintances described them as inseparable, often referring to them as best friends. They shared daily routines, personal conversations, and the kind of trust that comes from living together. That closeness made the crime especially difficult to comprehend. This was not a random act. It was violence that erupted inside a shared home, between people who knew each other well. As the case moved forward in 2019, more details emerged during court proceedings and sentencing that added critical context. Cutting admitted she was under the influence of multiple substances at the time of the killing. According to statements presented in court, she described being on what she called a cocktail of drugs, including cocaine, mushrooms, Xanax, and Adderall. In one of the most disturbing disclosures, Cutting claimed she believed she was doing cocaine with the devil during the attack. These statements were introduced as part of the explanation for her behavior, not as an excuse for the violence. Cutting's mental state became a key part of her defense strategy. Her attorneys argued that she was experiencing a psychotic episode at the time of the killing. That claim was supported by descriptions of her behavior at the scene, which responding officers and court records characterized as highly erratic. Prosecutors and defense attorneys referenced actions such as Cutting reciting the Hail Mary in Spanish and attempting to force her hand into her own mouth. These behaviors were presented as evidence of severe mental disturbance during the incident, offering insight into how the situation escalated to fatal violence. Despite these explanations, the physical facts of the case remained unchanged. Alexa Cannon was killed in her own home, stabbed more than 30 times by someone she trusted. There was no dispute about where the crime occurred or who was responsible. The court focused on accountability, while also weighing the role of substance use and mental health in Cutting's actions. The brutality of the attack played a central role in how prosecutors framed the seriousness of the crime. Unlike cases that drag on unresolved for years, this one reached a legal conclusion within months. On October 7, 2019, Louisa Cutting pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. That plea formally resolved the case, removing any doubt about responsibility. By the time the sentencing phase concluded, the focus had shifted from determining guilt to deciding punishment and long-term consequences. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the mitigating factors presented in court. Cutting was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with 20 years suspended. That resulted in an active sentence of 20 years of incarceration, followed by 10 years of supervised probation upon release. The sentence acknowledged the extreme violence involved, while also taking into account the arguments about mental state and substance influence raised during the proceedings. Case 5. Ricardo Medina Jr., known to many fans as a television hero, a familiar face from children's action shows. But in real life, his name became linked to one of the most shocking roommate killings involving a former TV actor. This is the true, verified story of how a shared home, rising tension, and a single violent confrontation led to the death of his roommate and ended Medina's acting career for good. In January 2015, Ricardo Medina Jr. was living in Green Valley, a rural community near Palmdale, California, where he shared a house with Joshua Sutter, a 36-year-old man who worked as a martial arts instructor and personal trainer. Court records and police statements confirm that the two men had ongoing disagreements about household issues. Friends later described the living situation as tense, with repeated arguments over responsibilities and personal space. These conflicts stayed inside the home until the night of January 31st, 2015. On that evening, an argument broke out inside the residence. According to investigators, the dispute became physical. During the confrontation, Sutter was stabbed with a sword kept inside the house. The wound proved fatal. Authorities confirmed that Sutter suffered serious injuries and later died despite emergency response. After the incident, Medina placed a call to 911 reporting what had happened. First responders arrived at the scene and found Sutter critically injured. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Medina was taken into custody that same night. The case immediately drew national attention because of Medina's television background. He had appeared in Power Rangers Wild Force and later played a leading role in Power Rangers Samurai. For many viewers, the contrast was striking. A former children's TV star was now at the center of a homicide investigation involving his own roommate. News outlets across the United States covered the arrest, and fans reacted with disbelief. In the days that followed, prosecutors faced a key legal question. While Medina was initially arrested on suspicion of murder, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office delayed filing formal charges. Investigators requested additional time to review evidence, witness statements, and forensic findings. As a result, Medina was briefly released while the investigation continued. This delay caused confusion and public debate, but prosecutors later stated it was necessary to ensure the case was handled correctly. Nearly 1 year later, in January 2016, Medina was formally rearrested and charged with murder. Prosecutors alleged that the fatal act went beyond self-defense. The case moved into the pre-trial phase, where Medina faced the possibility of a long prison sentence if convicted at trial. Court documents confirm that the weapon used was a sword, and Medina later admitted in court that he inflicted the fatal injury. As the legal process continued, both sides weighed their options. In March 2017, Medina reached a plea agreement with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to one felony count of voluntary manslaughter, acknowledging responsibility for the killing while avoiding the risk of a murder conviction. As part of the plea, Medina admitted using the sword during the confrontation. The agreement ended the need for a full jury trial and brought the case closer to resolution. On March 30, 2017, a judge in Los Angeles County Superior Court sentenced Ricardo Medina Jr. to 6 years in state prison. The sentence matched the maximum allowed under the plea deal. During sentencing, the court acknowledged the loss of Joshua Sutter's life and the lasting impact on his family. The judge also noted Medina's lack of prior violent criminal history, which factored into the final sentence. With that ruling, the criminal case officially came to an end. Medina later served several years behind bars and was eventually released on parole, according to public records. His acting career did not recover. Casting offers stopped, public appearances ended, and his name became permanently associated with the killing. Case 6. Whitney Joy Pauline Engler was nearing the end of a demanding journey. She was a fourth-year veterinary medicine student at the University of California, Davis, focused on finishing her training and beginning a career devoted to caring for animals. Friends and classmates described her as disciplined, compassionate, and deeply committed to her work. She lived off campus in Davis, California, sharing a duplex with a roommate, a common arrangement for graduate students managing heavy workloads and high living costs. On the night of March 26, 2015, that ordinary living situation turned into a tragedy. Late that evening, emergency services received a 911 call from inside the home on Glacier Drive. When police arrived in the early hours of March 27, 2015, they found two people suffering from gunshot wounds. Whitney Engler was already dead. Her roommate, 23-year-old Joseph Andrew Hine, was also found with a fatal gunshot wound. Investigators quickly determined that no intruder had entered the home and that there was no sign of a random attack. From the earliest moments of the investigation, police focused on the relationship between the two roommates. Authorities later confirmed that Whitney Engler died from multiple gunshot wounds. The Yolo County coroner ruled her death a homicide. Hines' death was ruled a suicide, caused by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Law enforcement concluded that Hines shot Engler and then took his own life shortly afterward. Police stated publicly that they did not believe anyone else was involved in the incident, and there was no evidence suggesting the presence of a third party. What made the case especially unsettling for the community was the lack of a clear public motive. Investigators did not release details indicating a history of reported violence between the two. There were no public records of restraining orders or prior police calls to the home. The conflict, whatever its nature, unfolded behind closed doors, invisible to neighbors and classmates. This silence left many questions unanswered and made the loss even harder for those who knew Whitney. The impact on the UC Davis campus was immediate. Whitney was just weeks away from completing her veterinary degree, a milestone she had worked toward for years. Her classmates, already under intense academic pressure, were forced to confront the sudden loss of one of their own. Vigils were held in her memory. Faculty members spoke about her dedication and kindness. For many students, the tragedy shattered the sense of safety they associated with shared housing and familiar routines. Joseph Andrew Hine, identified by police as the shooter, was also a young adult with his own future ahead of him. Reports described him as a helicopter pilot graduate. Despite investigators confirming his role in the shooting, authorities did not publicly identify a single triggering event or dispute that led to the violence. In official statements, police acknowledged that they could not fully explain what caused the situation to escalate to deadly force. One chilling detail later confirmed by investigators was the 911 call made shortly before Hines' death. Recordings released by authorities revealed that he contacted emergency services to report that two people had been shot. Not long after making that call, he ended his own life. Case 7. Brian Chirinos became the focus of a Livermore homicide investigation in late 2025 after police said he killed the man he lived with and then left the home, allowing the crime to remain undiscovered for days. This was not a murder revealed by an emergency call or an immediate police response. It unfolded quietly, inside a shared residence, until concern over silence led authorities to uncover what had happened. The man who died was David Hurst, 55 years old. Hurst was a respected public servant who served as an Alameda County Public Health Commissioner, a role that placed him at the center of health policy and community advocacy. He was known professionally for his civic engagement and work on public health issues. At home, however, his life was far more ordinary. He shared a house in Livermore with Chirinos, a much younger man, reflecting the reality of shared housing in high-cost regions. Court records later revealed that this living arrangement was not without strain. Before the killing, Hurst had complained about problems with Chirinos, indicating that tension existed inside the home before the fatal encounter. These concerns did not play out publicly. There were no widely reported police interventions immediately before the incident. Whatever conflict existed stayed inside the house, away from neighbors and co-workers. Investigators believe the homicide occurred on or around November 28, 2025. What makes the case especially unsettling is that David Hurst was not discovered right away. Days passed without public alarm, no emergency call, and no visible sign of violence. It was only on December 2, 2025, after police conducted a welfare check, that officers entered the residence and found Hurst dead. Authorities determined he had been fatally stabbed. From the outset, police ruled out a random intruder. There were no signs of forced entry and no evidence suggesting that anyone unfamiliar with the home had been involved. The investigation quickly narrowed to the dynamics inside the residence, specifically the relationship between Hurst and Chirinos. Detectives stated that the fatal stabbing stemmed from a confrontation between the two men, one that occurred privately and left no outside witnesses. The case took a decisive turn the following day. On December 3, 2025, Brian Chirinos was arrested in San Francisco. Police said he was taken into custody while driving David Hurst's car, a detail that directly linked him to the victim in the days after the killing. With that arrest, what had begun as a welfare check became a homicide investigation with a named suspect. As more information emerged, public records added further context to the case. Authorities confirmed that Chirinos had an extensive criminal history, including prior arrests in Florida and Texas. Those records included arrests related to domestic violence and false imprisonment, as well as an active warrant for battery at the time of Hurst's death. Investigators did not state that these past cases were directly connected to the Livermore killing, but the history added weight to concerns about the risks present inside the shared home. Police were careful in their public statements about motive. They confirmed that the stabbing followed a dispute between the roommates, but did not disclose what specifically triggered the confrontation. There were no official claims of a prolonged public feud or repeated emergency calls immediately before the homicide. What authorities emphasized instead was that this was a personal conflict that escalated inside a shared living space, out of view and unheard by others. On December 5, 2025, Brahim Chirinos was formally charged with murder. Court records show that he was ordered held without bail and remanded to Santa Rita Jail, reflecting the seriousness of the charge and the risk factors identified by prosecutors. From that point forward, the case moved fully into the criminal justice system. The delayed discovery of the crime sent shockwaves through the community. David Hurst was not just a private citizen. As a public health commissioner, he held a role tied directly to community well-being and public trust. News of his death spread quickly among colleagues and civic leaders, many of whom struggled to reconcile his professional visibility with the quiet way his life ended. The idea that a public official could be killed in his own home and not found for days deeply unsettled the region. Case 8. Richard Benaw was not a public figure, but his case became one of the most disturbing examples of how a roommate conflict can turn deadly. What unfolded inside a shared home in Springdale, Prince George's County, Maryland, shows how an ordinary disagreement can escalate into irreversible violence and how actions taken afterward can define the outcome in court. The murder occurred on January 10, 2024. Court records identify the victim as Dominique Scott Hayes, a 27-year-old man who lived in the home with Benaw. According to trial testimony, the confrontation began in the early morning hours when Hayes woke Benaw to ask about the location of a TV remote control. What started as a routine household question quickly escalated into a heated argument inside the bedroom. Prosecutors told jurors this dispute was the direct trigger for the violence that followed. Benaw claimed he acted in self-defense, telling investigators that Hayes was armed. Police later confirmed that Hayes was found with 3 knives, one in each hand and one tucked into his waistband. Benaw relied on this fact to argue that he feared for his life. However, prosecutors acknowledged the presence of the knives while emphasizing that the physical evidence did not support a lawful self-defense claim. According to the state, Benaw used a handgun and continued to fire even as Hayes attempted to flee the room, suggesting the threat had passed. This point proved critical. Jurors were instructed to consider not just whether Hayes was armed, but whether Benaw's response was reasonable and necessary. They ultimately rejected the self-defense argument. What happened after the shooting became just as damaging to Benaw's case. Prosecutors established that he went back to sleep rather than calling for help. Hours later, he left the home and went about his day, visiting a marijuana dispensary and a tobacco shop. During this time, Hayes remained dead inside the residence. Benaw did not contact emergency services until several hours later, a delay prosecutors described as deliberate. Investigators also presented evidence of tampering. Benaw flushed spent shell casings down a toilet, an act prosecutors argued showed an attempt to interfere with the investigation. At trial, the state stressed that someone who believed they had acted in lawful self-defense would have no reason to destroy evidence or delay contacting authorities. These post-crime actions played a major role in how the jury assessed Benaw's credibility and intent. As the investigation progressed, Benaw was initially charged with manslaughter, but prosecutors later upgraded the charges as evidence mounted, He ultimately stood trial for second-degree murder, along with use of a handgun in a crime of violence and tampering with evidence. The jury convicted him on all counts. At sentencing on September 12, 2025, the courtroom heard from Hayes' family. His mother, Monique Scott, delivered a statement that underscored the jury's findings, telling the court that her son had been chased down like a dog and murdered. The judge cited the killing, the rejection of self-defense, and Benau's actions afterward when imposing a 50-year prison sentence. Case 9. Mohammed Ibrahim stood before a judge at Birmingham Crown Court and admitted to killing the man he lived with. He shared a house in multiple occupation in Acox Green, Birmingham, a place where unrelated adults lived side by side with little privacy and constant proximity. By the time the case reached court, prosecutors would describe months of bad blood inside that house, tension that stayed hidden until it turned fatal. Ibrahim lived alongside Morteza Ajdani, a 60-year-old housemate. Court proceedings later made clear that their relationship had deteriorated over time. This was not a sudden clash between strangers. Prosecutors told the court that hostility had been building for several months, shaped by shared space and unresolved disputes. In an HMO, there is no easy escape from conflict. Doors lead back to the same hallways, and silence can become pressure. On the 1st of February 2025, emergency services were called to the shared property. Police arrived to find Morteza Ajdani suffering from a serious stab wound. Despite medical efforts, he died from his injuries. Officers found no signs of a break-in and no evidence of an outside attacker. The scene pointed inward, toward the people who lived there. In the immediate aftermath, Mohammed Ibrahim did not accept responsibility. According to court records, he attempted to mislead officers by claiming that Mr. Ajdani had stabbed himself, telling police that his housemate had had enough of his life. Investigators quickly questioned this account. The nature of the wound and the physical evidence did not support a self-inflicted injury. As detectives gathered more information, Ibrahim's version of events began to collapse. CCTV footage from inside the house became central to the investigation. Prosecutors later described the sequence shown on the recordings. The confrontation began in the kitchen, where Ibrahim was seen confronting Ajdani. Rather than advancing, Ajdani appeared to retreat. The footage showed him backing away, trying to put distance between himself and the threat in front of him. The camera then captured the movement toward the bathroom. Ajdani continued to retreat, and Ibrahim followed. In that confined space, the confrontation reached its fatal end. Prosecutors told the court that Ibrahim plunged a knife into Ajdani's abdomen, inflicting the wound that would kill him. The footage directly contradicted Ibrahim's claim of self-harm and established a clear sequence of pursuit and attack. Morteza Ajdani's death was formally ruled a homicide. The evidence showed that this was not an accident and not an act of self-injury. It was a deliberate killing carried out after months of hostility inside a shared home. For the local community, the case was especially disturbing because the violence occurred in a place meant to provide shelter, not danger. Mohammed Ibrahim was charged with murder, and the case was scheduled to go to trial at Birmingham Crown Court. However, on 28 July 2025, the day the trial was set to begin, Ibrahim changed his plea to guilty. The decision came after the prosecution outlined the strength of its case, including the CCTV footage that tracked the confrontation from the kitchen to the bathroom. By entering a guilty plea, Ibrahim accepted responsibility for killing his housemate. The guilty plea meant that a full trial did not proceed, but the court still examined the facts during sentencing. The judge addressed both the killing and Ibrahim's attempt to mislead the police afterward. The court made clear that falsely claiming the victim had taken his own life added to the seriousness of the offense. Trust had been violated twice, first by the act itself and again by the attempt to shift blame. On the 6th of August 2025, the court delivered its sentence. Mohammed Ibrahim received a life sentence, with a minimum term of 16 years and 8 months before he can be considered for parole. The judge emphasized that this was not a fixed-term sentence. The minimum term represents the earliest possible point for review, not a promise of release. The punishment reflected the deliberate nature of the killing, the pursuit shown on CCTV, and the breach of trust inherent in murdering a housemate. During sentencing remarks, the judge acknowledged the months-long tension between the men but firmly rejected any suggestion that conflict could excuse violence. The court highlighted the impact on Morteza Ajdani's family, who lost a loved one without warning. A shared home became a crime scene, and a life ended where safety should have existed. Case 10. Dylan Thomas and William Bush had been friends since childhood, a relationship that stretched back years before they ever shared a house. By 2023, they were living together in Llandaff, Cardiff, a choice that once seemed natural for two people who had grown up side by side. From the outside, it looked like a familiar arrangement between young men navigating adult life. Inside the house, however, the situation had become unstable, shaped by fear, confusion, and a growing sense that something was seriously wrong. In the weeks before the killing, Dylan Thomas's mental health had declined sharply. During the trial, medical experts told the court that Thomas was suffering from schizophrenia and psychosis. These conditions affected how he thought and how he understood the world around him. The sentencing judge later accepted that Thomas's mental illness impaired his judgment. However, the court was firm in its conclusion that he still understood the nature of his actions. His condition did not remove his ability to tell right from wrong, and it did not reduce his responsibility for what he did. Evidence presented to the court showed that Thomas's behavior had already brought him to police attention. Just weeks before Christmas Eve, he had been arrested near Buckingham Palace after attempting to climb a fence. At the time, he told officers he was looking for what he described as energy fields. Court records later clarified that Thomas was released on police bail following that incident. The episode was not treated as an isolated event, but as part of a wider pattern of unusual and concerning behavior that had begun to alarm people around him. William Bush, who was 23 years old, was among those who felt increasingly unsafe. The court heard that in the weeks leading up to the killing, Bush had become afraid of Thomas's unpredictable conduct. Evidence showed that he had started barricading his bedroom door at night, using furniture to keep himself protected while he slept. This detail painted a clear picture for the jury. Bush did not feel secure in his own home, yet he continued living there, hoping the situation would not turn violent. On the morning of the 24th of December 2023, Christmas Eve, Dylan Thomas was driven to the Llandaff house by his grandmother. He told her that he needed to go there to walk his dog. There was nothing outwardly alarming about the trip, and she had no reason to believe anything was wrong. Later, this moment became one of the last calm points in the timeline before the events that followed. Inside the house, an argument broke out between Thomas and Bush. What began as a dispute escalated rapidly. Evidence showed that Thomas left the immediate area, went to the kitchen, and returned armed with knives. The attack that followed was sustained and violent. Medical evidence presented at trial confirmed that William Bush suffered dozens of stab wounds, causing extreme pain and fatal injuries. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing they could do. Bush was pronounced dead at the scene. Police found no signs of forced entry and no evidence of an outside attacker. There was no indication that anyone else had been involved. Forensic evidence recovered from the house confirmed that the violence came from within the shared home. Investigators also uncovered online searches made by Thomas before the killing, including searches related to the human body. These searches were later used by prosecutors to support the argument that Thomas was aware of what he was doing. At Cardiff Crown Court, Dylan Thomas admitted that he had caused William Bush's death but denied murder. His legal team argued that his schizophrenia and psychosis meant he should be convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. Psychiatrists gave evidence about his mental illness and how it affected his thinking. The prosecution accepted that Thomas was mentally unwell, but argued that he still understood the seriousness of his actions and the harm he was causing. After hearing all the evidence, the jury rejected the manslaughter argument. In November 2024, Dylan Thomas was found guilty of murder. Sentencing took place on 24th of January 2025. During sentencing, the judge explained how the punishment was calculated. The starting point for the minimum term was 15 years. However, the judge said this was not sufficient given the seriousness of the case. The minimum term was increased to 19 years due to several aggravating factors. These included the betrayal of trust, as Bush had been attacked by a lifelong friend and housemate, and the extreme suffering Bush experienced during the prolonged attack. The judge told the court that while Thomas's mental illness impaired his judgment, it did not excuse the violence or reduce his culpability. Dylan Thomas was sentenced to life imprisonment and will not be eligible for parole consideration until he has served at least 19 years. Case 11. Sheldon Rodriguez was 30 years old when a shared house in Hayes, West London, became the stage for a murder driven not by a sudden disagreement, but by years of fixation, surveillance, and control. He lived in a house share, a common arrangement in London, alongside Stephanie Hansen, a 39-year-old woman who had no idea that her private life was being watched, recorded, and obsessed over by the man living under the same roof. What unfolded inside that house was not a spontaneous outburst. Prosecutors would later describe it as the violent endpoint of a long and dangerous pattern. At trial, the court heard that Rodriguez had harbored a 7-year obsession with Hansen. This was not hidden jealousy or quiet resentment. Investigators uncovered evidence that Rodriguez had secretly planted multiple surveillance devices inside the home to monitor her movements and conversations. Among them was a microphone hidden inside a television, used to listen to Hansen's private phone calls and personal interactions. Prosecutors told the jury that Rodriguez used these devices to track her social life, her dates, and her attempts to move on with her life, all without her knowledge. The murder was triggered on the day Rodriguez listened in on a date Hansen had with her new partner while he was at work. According to the prosecution, he monitored the encounter remotely, growing increasingly angry as he listened. The court later described what followed as an explosion of rage. Rodriguez returned to the house after work and attacked Hansen while she was still in her pajamas, in what prosecutors said was a calculated and targeted assault fueled by jealousy and obsession rather than chance. The severity of the violence was central to both the prosecution's case and the judge's sentencing remarks. Stephanie Hansen suffered nearly 60 separate injuries. The court heard that she was stabbed 20 times in the neck, an area prosecutors said showed intent to kill. In addition to the knife wounds, Hansen sustained 39 blunt force injuries, inflicted using household items including a hairdryer and a large fan. The violence was prolonged and extreme, far beyond what could be described as a brief confrontation. The judge later emphasized that the level of brutality demonstrated sustained intent and overwhelming force. After the killing, Rodriguez did not call for help. Instead, prosecutors said he tried to manipulate the narrative. The court heard that he sent fake messages to Hansen's boyfriend, using the name Jamie Oliver, in an effort to harass him and create confusion. Investigators later concluded that Rodriguez attempted to frame the boyfriend for the murder, directing suspicion away from himself. This deceptive behavior, carried out after Hansen was already dead, was presented as further evidence of calculation rather than panic. Police investigations quickly dismantled that attempt at deception. Forensic evidence inside the house, combined with digital records, exposed Rodriguez's actions before and after the killing. The hidden surveillance devices, the monitoring of Hansen's private life, and the fabricated messages all formed a picture of a man who had been exerting secret control for years. Prosecutors told the court this was not a crime that developed overnight. It was the result of long-term obsession that escalated once Hansen began a new relationship. The case moved through the UK courts with grim clarity. The jury found Rodriguez guilty of murder, and the sentencing hearing laid bare the full extent of his conduct. The judge highlighted the planning involved, the secret surveillance, the extreme violence, and the attempts to blame an innocent man. Taken together, these factors placed the crime among the most serious categories of murders under UK law. Sheldon Rodriguez was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel.